In the hours before dawn on June 6, 1944, a German artillery officer named Werner Hein, attached to a coastal defense battery positioned atop the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc, wrote a line in his personal notebook that survived the war only because it was recovered from a dugout his unit abandoned in the confusion of the assault. It read, "We were told the cliffs themselves were our defense. We were told no one climbs a vertical rock face under fire and lives to fire back. I watched them do exactly this, and I no longer understand what the word impossible is supposed to mean." He was not describing a diversion or a secondary objective. He was describing the assault of the 2nd Ranger Battalion of the United States Army on one of the most heavily fortified coastal gun positions on the entire Normandy coastline, a position German defensive doctrine considered essentially unassailable by direct frontal attack. This is not a story assembled from American unit histories or the celebrated legacy of the Ranger tradition. This is a story built from German coastal defense reports, prisoner interrogations, and the private assessments of officers who had every professional reason to describe the position's defenses as adequate, and who instead, again and again, reached for language that described not a battle lost, but a fundamental assumption proven false, one that governed how an entire section of the Atlantic coastline had been prepared for invasion. To understand why Pointe du Hoc mattered and why German commanders considered it nearly unassailable, you need to understand what the position actually was. Rising more than 30 meters above the English Channel, the promontory hosted what German coastal artillery planners believed to be 6 155mm guns, capable of raining fire on both the American landing beaches at Omaha and Utah simultaneously. The position's defense relied on a specific and, to German planners, entirely sound assumption. The cliff face itself, sheer and often exceeding 30 meters in height, was considered a natural fortification requiring minimal additional defense against direct assault, since no infantry force could reasonably be expected to scale it while under fire from the defenders positioned at the top. German engineers had reinforced the position with machine gun nests, trench networks, and observation posts oriented primarily to repel an assault from inland, not from the vertical rock face itself. Oberleutnant Kurt Bittner, an engineer officer who had overseen portions of the position's fortification, wrote in a report filed months before the invasion, "The cliff approach requires no additional fortification beyond what nature has already provided. Any force attempting to scale this face while under direct fire from the position above would be destroyed before achieving any foothold sufficient to threaten the battery." This was not an unreasonable assessment. It reflected standard military doctrine applied to a genuinely formidable natural obstacle. The 2nd Ranger Battalion, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder, was assigned the mission of eliminating the Pointe du Hoc battery specifically because Allied planners understood the gun's potential to devastate the landing forces at both nearby beaches if left operational during the critical hours of the invasion. The plan called for Rangers to approach the base of the cliff by landing craft under direct observation and fire from the defenders above, and then to scale the vertical rock face using rope ladders, grappling hooks fired from modified rocket launchers, and extension ladders borrowed from London fire brigades, all while German soldiers positioned at the cliff's edge fired down directly onto the climbing men, and in several documented instances, cut the ropes themselves once they caught on the cliff edge. By any conventional military calculation, an assault of this kind against defenders who needed only to look down and fire or cut a rope to eliminate an attacker should have failed catastrophically within the first minutes of contact. Hauptmann Alfred Krantz, commanding infantry elements responsible for the clifftop defense, filed an assessment describing the opening phase of the assault. He wrote, "American forces approached the base of the cliff under direct fire from our positions and began scaling the rock face using ropes and ladders while still under fire from above. Standard defensive doctrine assumes an EUVA attacking force in this position, exposed and without cover, cannot sustain forward momentum. This was not the case. However, the tactical reality facing the German defenders in the minutes following the initial landing was considerably more disruptive than a single failed assumption about the cliff's defensive value. As Rangers began reaching the clifftop despite sustained fire, cut ropes, and grenades thrown down from above, they did not consolidate cautiously or wait for reinforcement before engaging the defensive positions directly. Feldwebel Hans Brenner, a non-commissioned officer positioned near one of the main trench lines atop the cliff, wrote in an account given during post-war interviews, "Soldiers who reached the top of the cliff, having just survived a climb under direct fire that by any reasonable expectation should have killed most of them, did not pause to catch their breath or wait for others to join them before moving directly into our trench positions. They fought as though the climb itself, which any of our own soldiers would have considered the most dangerous part of the operation, had simply been the price of admission to the actual fight, which they then proceeded to win with the same intensity." Yet one variable remained systematically unaccounted for in the German assessments compiled both before and immediately after the assault, appearing with striking consistency across reports filed by officers who had no incentive to inflate the caliber of an American unit, their own defensive doctrine considered incapable of achieving a foothold under these specific conditions. That variable concerned the specific relationship between the surviving Rangers and the concept of the mission's continuation once the primary objective, the coastal guns themselves, was discovered to have been relocated inland by German artillery crews shortly before the invasion as a precaution against naval bombardment. German doctrine assumed that a raiding force discovering its primary objective absent would prioritize consolidation and defense of the captured position while awaiting further orders or reinforcement, a rational calculation given the disruption such a discovery typically caused to a unit's operational planning. Instead, small Ranger patrols, understanding the guns had to be somewhere nearby and still capable of threatening the landing beaches, moved inland from the captured position, searching adjacent orchards and farmland while still isolated from any reinforcement and surrounded by German forces still contesting the broader area. If you're new to this channel, this is exactly the kind of history we cover, accounts drawn not from the victors' commemorations, but from the defenders' own internal reports, the version they filed for their own commanders and never expected the other side to read. If that kind of documented, unfiltered history is what you come here for, subscribing costs nothing and tells us to keep excavating these archives. A Ranger patrol operating inland from the captured clifftop position located the battery's actual guns, unguarded and positioned in a sunken lane roughly a kilometer from the original emplacements, and destroyed them using thermite grenades before German forces in the area understood the guns had even been found. Major Werner Hein, the same officer whose notebook entry opens this account, continued in a separate passage recovered from his unit's records. He wrote, "The guns had been moved specifically to protect them from naval bombardment, a sound precaution given the weight of fire directed at the original position. What we did not anticipate was a small number of soldiers, cut off from their main force and having just survived an assault we considered nearly impossible, would continue searching for a hidden objective rather than consolidating their position and waiting for the situation to develop in their favor. This is not the behavior our training assumes from an isolated force operating deep inside contested territory with no secure line of retreat." Read that sentence again. A German officer, describing men who had already survived what his own doctrine considered a near impossible assault, is admitting that the mission continued past the point where any reasonable military calculation would have expected it to pause, and that this continuation, not the initial cliff assault itself, ultimately eliminated the specific threat the entire operation had been designed to remove. It never behaved like doctrine predicted, not once. The mission had been designed around the assumption that reaching the guns would be the hard part, and everything after that would be simple mop-up. Among the individual accounts populating the German record of the Pointe du Hoc engagement, one detail recurs with particular frequency concerning the extended period during which the Rangers who had captured the position held it against repeated German counterattacks while cut off from the main invasion force, awaiting relief that would not arrive for nearly 2 days. Oberst Friedrich Halm, coordinating counterattack forces in the sector, wrote in a report recovered after the battle, "Repeated attacks against the American position atop the cliff have failed to dislodge a force reduced to a small fraction of its original strength through casualties. A force in this condition, isolated, outnumbered, and without secure resupply, should by any reasonable military calculation have been eliminated or forced to surrender well before this point in the engagement." However, the tactical picture that emerged from prisoner interrogations conducted throughout the extended engagement revealed a further dimension to this pattern. An intelligence officer identified in captured records only by the surname Voigt wrote, "Prisoners taken during the counterattacks demonstrate a consistent understanding among the defending force that relief would eventually arrive from the beach landing forces, and this expectation appears to have sustained their defensive cohesion despite mounting losses and isolation. This differs from what we would expect of a force whose confidence in eventual relief should reasonably have eroded given the extended duration of their isolation." The Rangers atop Pointe du Hoc held their position for approximately 2 days before relief finally arrived overland from Omaha Beach, having suffered casualties that reduced the assault force to roughly a third of its original strength, a toll German assessments consistently cited as evidence that the position's defenses had functioned largely as designed against the initial assault. General Major Dietrich Vanner, reviewing the engagement for a divisional assessment, wrote, "The defensive preparations at this position were adequate by every reasonable standard we could apply prior to the assault. The outcome of this engagement resulted not from any deficiency in our defensive planning, but from an assault force that continued to function effectively under conditions of isolation, sustained casualties, and operational uncertainty that exceeded any precedent available to us from earlier engagements against Western Allied forces in this theater." What the German record ultimately preserves across coastal defense reports, intelligence memoranda, and the post-war reflections of officers who commanded a position they had every professional reason to consider among the most secure on the entire invasion coastline is not primarily a story of overwhelming American numerical or material advantage. The Rangers who scaled the cliff at Pointe du Hoc did so under direct fire, using ropes that were cut from above, against defenders who needed only to look down to identify a target, and the force that ultimately eliminated the position's actual guns did so isolated, outnumbered, and searching for an objective that German planners had deliberately hidden. There is a further detail in the German record worth examining separately, because it appears not in a single officer's account, but across several reports filed by men who had no contact with one another during the 2 days of fighting. Multiple German accounts describe the Rangers' conduct during the extended isolation atop the cliff in terms that suggest something more specific than simple stubbornness. Feldwebel Brenner's account, given decades later, continued on this point. "We expected that a force cut off in this manner would eventually show signs of the collapse we associated with isolated units under siege. Ammunition discipline in particular surprised us. Prisoners and captured positions showed evidence of careful rationing rather than the desperate expenditure we anticipated from a force expecting imminent defeat. This suggests men who continued to plan for a defense lasting longer than their immediate circumstances would seem to justify." General Major Vanner's post-war assessment addressed this same quality from a different angle. He wrote, "What our doctrine did not adequately account for was a force that appeared to operate under the assumption that relief was a certainty rather than a hope, and organized its defense accordingly across a timeline that exceeded what isolated men typically permit themselves to believe." This distinction between defending out of hope and defending out of confident expectation recurs across the German record with enough consistency that it appears to describe something closer to an institutional characteristic than an accident of individual temperament. It is a more specific story about a particular military institution's capacity to treat a discovered obstacle, whether a cliff face, a relocated objective, or an extended isolation awaiting relief, not as a reason to reconsider the mission, but as the next problem to be solved in sequence. German officers, writing in the careful and unsentimental language of professional soldiers describing the failure of a position they had genuinely believed was secure, repeatedly identified this quality, not firepower, not numbers, as the actual mechanism of their defeat. The men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion who reached the top of the cliff at Pointe du Hoc on the morning of June 6, 1944, did not do so because the climb was survivable by any reasonable calculation. They did so because, having survived the parts of the mission everyone had told them were the hardest part, the rest of it had simply become the next thing standing between them and finishing the job.